Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I love being in Atlanta where people always tell you hello back. I am Claire Haley. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Atlanta History Center. I know I've gotten to talk to a few of you who have been on our virtual talks for the past several months, so it's really nice to meet some of y'all in person. Thank you for coming out tonight to our Author Talk series. We are so thrilled to be welcoming author Bob Drury tonight, one half of the amazing duo behind the book that many of you have in your hands already, The Last Hill. If you've not yet purchased your copy of the book, you can do so tonight. It's 25% off tonight only. Great Christmas present, just saying, if you want to get ahead of that. And I know a lot of you were able to get your book signed by Bob before the event, but if you haven't, he's going to be signing after as well. He will be taking your questions tonight at the end of his remarks. So if you have questions, be thinking of those. I'll come around with the mic to grab those from you. And I just want to thank so many of you were so understanding of us having to reschedule this evening. Really appreciate your flexibility. We're sad that Tom was not able to be here this evening, but we are very excited that Bob was able to make an additional stop on his cross-country book tour to make a stop here in Atlanta tonight. Bob's an award-winning journalist. He's the author of over 10 nonfiction books, several of which have spent many, many times, almost a half a year on the New York Times bestseller list. And the book that you have in your hands tonight is just a testament to that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's featured author, Bob Drury.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's an honor and a pleasure, I might add, to be here tonight at the Atlanta History Center. Thank you, Claire, for that lovely introduction, some of which was true. And I apologize in advance because you didn't get Tom Clavin. He was taken by a sudden illness, and he's so much better than I am. So please, Claire, I hope you didn't hand out any rotten tomatoes tonight, if you'll all bear with me. So anyway, I am well aware. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I'm well aware that the four most important words in any public speaker's vocabulary are, and so, in conclusion. So I will try to make this as short and sweet and as informative, I hope, as I can. So I'm sure that you're aware that at events like these, it's customary for an author to maybe read a short passage or two from his or her new book, something that really gets to the heart of the story. So with that in mind, I will pick up The Last Hill. And on page 258, I noticed I have written a Post-it note to myself saying, "You put yourself to sleep when you read aloud. Please, please, please don't bore these good people by reading from this book." So that ends the reading portion of tonight's program. Instead, how about if I just tell you a couple stories, kind of inside stories about how this narrative came to be, how we researched it, reported it out, how we put it to paper. Kind of inside baseball kind of stuff. I always get asked inside baseball stuff in the Q&A portion. So I figure let's just cut to the chase and talk about inside baseball. You never know, especially if you're a nonfiction writer, you never know when a good book idea is going to sneak up on you and smack you upside the head. I'll give you an example. This is years ago. I was having dinner. I was in Quantico at Marine headquarters, and I was having dinner with an official Marine historian. He worked in Quantico. He had helped Tom and I out, my co-author Tom Clavin. He had helped us out with the research for our book, The Last Stand of Fox Company, and I happened to be in Quantico for something else, and I said, I have to take you to dinner as a thank you. So I think it was during we're being served coffee, and he said, naturally, "What's your next project, you and Clavin?" And I said, "Well, we've got a couple things on the burner. We're looking at this and that. We're not quite sure where we're going." And he said, "Have you ever heard of the Sioux Indian warrior chief called Red Cloud?" And he could probably tell by the look on my face that I was not quite familiar with who he was talking about. And he said, "You ought to look into Red Cloud. He's the only Native American to win a war, not a battle, a war against the United States." And that little dropping of a name ended up becoming our book, The Heart of Everything That Is, because a Marine Corps historian took an inordinate, kind of an amateur interest in the American Indian Wars of the 19th century. We spent 25 weeks on the Times bestseller list. That's what Claire was talking about. It just happens in the weirdest way. A Marine, now in his 80s, or then in his 80s, he has since passed, who was one of the protagonists in The Last Stand of Fox Company, I stayed friendly with him, Uncle Dickie. He was a nuts guy. He was a New Yorker. It was back in the day where he was arrested several times for stealing cars in the Bronx in New York City. And the judge said, it's the Marines or it's jail. So he went into the Marines and he won the Bronze Star. Anyway, I stayed in touch with Uncle Dickie. And one day I get this email from him and there's an attachment. And it's a 5-minute clip of an Army Air Corps crew, the most decorated Army Air Corps crew of World War II. It's in the Southwest Pacific. And Uncle Dickie, I called him up. I said, what's this all about? He said, I sent it to you. These guys could have been Marines. Because you know how I feel about the Army, but these guys could have been Marines. It turned into our book, Lucky 666, about the most decorated Army air crew of World War II. So, as it happened, speaking of the last hill, several years ago, I'm out having a beer with a good friend of mine, a former U.S. Army retired lieutenant colonel, artilleryman. And I don't recall, we were discussing some military disaster. It was before Ukraine. We were putting the finishing touches, Tom and I were putting the finishing touches on Blood and Treasure, our Daniel Boone book. So it's before Ukraine. We were probably talking about something that happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. And he suddenly throws up his hands. And he says, reminds me of the debacle in the Hurtgen Forest in World War II. And I'm like, the what now? The who? The what? The what forest? What's this? And I should just interject for accuracy. He was a crusty old former lieutenant colonel. He did not use the word debacle. In fact, the phrase he used began with the word cluster, if you take my drift. So anyway, he had stopped me, called the what? Huh? The what? I'd never heard of the World War II battle of the Hurtgen Forest. So naturally, my curiosity is aroused. I called Tom that afternoon or that night, and I said, maybe we should look into this, see if there's something there. Let's do some cursory research. And man, were we rewarded. This story had everything. Undaunted courage from GIs, personal sacrifice. It just a lot of blood and gore, a lot. In fact, I should warn you again, we got a review last week. I can't remember, it might have been in the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember. But the reviewer gave us a good review, but he cautioned his readers that this book, The Last Hill, is not for the faint of heart or queasy of stomach. There's a lot of gore in this book. So, we're talking, body parts strewn across the forest floor of the Hurtgen woodland. We're talking about GIs fused together by direct artillery hits. We're talking about the impermeable stench of gas gangrene just permeating the forest as it escaped from the thousands of dead and dying Americans and Germans. In fact, the German defenders called the Hurtgen Forest the Grüne Helle, the green hell. And it was an apt description. But as Tom and I are looking into the story, what it did not have, at least for me, or at least at first, was a through line. It didn't have a narrative. And I'm thinking, so I pulled out my official, United States War Department history of the Siegfried Line campaign of September, October, November 1944. And yes, I am the kind of nerd who has the official War Department history of the Siegfried Line campaign on his home bookshelf. And I started reading. And the report, a real doorstop of a book. It was written by, in 1963, by the United States War Department's, by then the Pentagon's, chief historian, Charles McDonald. And McDonald was a good writer, and coincidentally, he had also served as a 21-year-old infantry officer during the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. And even McDonald's official chronicle of this engagement, this 3-month engagement, September, October, November, describes it as a top-to-bottom catastrophe for the United States Army. I mean, as I mentioned before, the fight was a real meat grinder, and McDonald pulled no punches in limbing how we were on our way. When I say we, I mean the Allies, the American armies in the Hurtgen. There were 2 of them. Were on our way to getting our ass kicked by the Wehrmacht. The Germans were no longer, after Normandy beach, they were no longer defending Paris or Brussels or Antwerp. They were defending the fatherland. The Hurtgen Forest straddled the Belgian-German frontier. And they had orders from Hitler to, let me make sure I get this quote right, "You will stand to the last man and the last cartridge. You will stand or die." I mean, that was from Adolf Hitler. So across this 70-square-mile woodland, the Hurtgen Forest, it's freezing, it's muddy, it's dank, it's like something out of the imagination of the Brothers Grimm, with more blood, a lot more blood. The battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and the ultimate objective of the Americans was, in this 3-months-long engagement, was the capture of this hill, Hill 400, they called it. That was its height in meters, 1,300 feet. And that's the last hill of our book title. And now Hill 400 was the highest mini mountain on the eastern edge of the forest. It actually straddled the Belgian-German frontier. And from atop this Hill 400, German artillery spotters had been pouring continuous fire. They could see the entire forest. They had these state-of-the-art nice artillery sites. They could see the entire forest, and they were pouring continuous and murderous artillery fire on any Americans who ventured into the forest to try to take Hill 400. And there was good reason for this defense, because unbeknownst at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, the Supreme Allied Commander, he felt that if we didn't break into the heart of Germany, into the Rhine River Valley, where all their munitions factories were, where their chemical factories were, where if we didn't break through to the Rhine by the end of the year 1944, the Germans would have a chance to redeploy, catch their breath. So far, it had been since the breakthrough at Normandy, it had been mostly what the War Department called pursuit warfare. In other words, we were chasing the hell out of them across France, across the Netherlands, across Belgium. And Eisenhower felt if we can break into the heart of Germany through the Hurtgen Forest, the war will be over. End the war in 44. That was the saying. End the war in 44. But the Germans could read a map too. And what Eisenhower or no Allied commander knew, what no Allied intelligence officer knew, was that behind the Hurtgen Forest, the Germans were assembling a giant counterattack. This was their last gasp on the Western Front. A counterattack, of course, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge. So this is why Hitler was ordering stand or die. He could not allow any Allied army into German territory to discover that this Battle of the Bulge, or this what was to be called the Battle of the Bulge, was being assembled. So during those 3 months, the Americans had sent something, disparate regiments from 4 separate American divisions had sent something like 50,000 GIs into the Hurtgen Forest with the objective of moving forward to Hill 400, the last hill. of those 50,000 GIs, 15,000 of them were casualties. DIA, killed, KIA, killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action. And, or as Charles MacDonald, that official historian, this line, it's so evocative, but it's also so sad. He writes in his official War Department history, 1 man down for every 3 feet gained across a 20-mile front. Think about it. That's 3 feet. That's 1 man down. That's 3 feet. That's another man down. Extrapolate that across 20 miles. That's how we were getting. That's what the situation was. So, anyway, back to that inside baseball stuff. I'm reading all this. Tom's reading this. I'm relaying it to him. I'm saying, no wonder nobody ever wrote about the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest before. No wonder nobody ever heard of it. I mean, everyone, whether you're an official historian, a popular historian like Tom and I, D-Day, maybe the fall of Paris, the liberation of Paris, then the Battle of the Bulge. But frankly, most historians and authors, they didn't want to write about the Hurtgen Forest and Hill 400. That's pretty much how Tom and I were feeling, too. I mean, let's face it, it's depressing. Who wants to read this kind of book? But then, I'm reading on in MacDonald's official history of the War Department, and I came across a brief mention, no more than an aside, a couple of paragraphs, about this battered Ranger battalion. By this point in the war, they had been reduced to some 400 officers, non-coms, and enlisted men. And they had performed heroically at Normandy Beach. And they had performed heroically during the post-invasion Battle of the Brittany campaign. It was kind of the last stand of the Germans in France. And so as a last resort, General Eisenhower decides to send this Ranger battalion into the Hurtgen Forest. Deploy them to the Hurtgen. Perhaps they can change the tide. 400 men, where 50,000 before them had not been able to move forward. And as it turned out, this small unit of special operators, the Rangers in the subtitle of our book, they actually ended up succeeding where the scores of regiments before them had failed. That is, they indeed captured. And for a time, they held Hill 400, the last hill. You could imagine how this tidbit struck me. I mean, choose your own metaphor. Alarm bells going off, antenna going up in my head. I reread those paragraphs. I called Tom. I said, it's got my attention. There's something here. There's something here with these Rangers. So now I was certainly cognizant. I mean, I've been in this business a while. I was certainly cognizant of small unit fighting in World War II. I mean, I grew up on movies like Merrill's Marauders. Jeff Chandler played Frank Merrill, about guerrilla war fighting, Americans fighting guerrilla actions in Burma, and television shows. I remember a show, The Rat Pack. It was in black and white, and it was vaguely based on an outfit called Darby's Rangers in North Africa. Darby's Rangers were the first Rangers to see action in World War II. They were landed in North Africa, and they spent their time behind the lines blowing up the fuel dumps and the like of the Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, commander of the famed Afrika Corps. So these lightning strike, in and out, clandestine operators, they were Darby's Rangers, Merrill's Marauders, they were the brainchild of the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. Now, in 1942, April of 1942, General Marshall was in London conferring with Winston Churchill about the cross-channel invasion of France. When should it occur? How should it occur? Where should it occur? And Churchill convinced Marshall that the United States should stand up several units based on Churchill's beloved commandos. When Churchill was a young man, he was a journalist. He covered the Boer War, and he watched the South African commandos. And ever since, he'd been in love with special operators. So the idea, small, mobile, elusive units, capable of performing specific, sometimes near suicidal tasks that were really not suited to the ponderous and often hidebound division and regiments of of the U.S. Army. This appealed to Marshall's sense of adventure, and this despite the fact that the majority, a vast majority, preponderance of U.S. Army officers looked down on the concept of special operators. They considered it a sideshow. What do we need cowboys and Indians running around the European theater of operation for? They were still in thrall of Ulysses S. Grant. Push, bang, push, bang, push. We don't need any guys going behind the lines. We're just going to bang the Germans back into Germany, and then we're going to devour them. So Marshall, however, as I said, he loved the audaciousness of the idea of these clandestine operators, and he tasked one of his most ferocious general officers, General Lucian B. Truscott, with creating these special forces almost from scratch. Not almost from scratch, from scratch. And by the way, Truscott was thinking of naming them the U.S. Commandos until then Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, still working a stateside post in the War Department's planning department, suggested to Truscott, he wrote to Truscott and he said, commandos, it sounds a little too British. What about Rangers? What do you think of Rangers? You know, after Robert Rogers's Rangers from nearly 2 centuries earlier, who had proven such effective backwood fighters during the French and Indian War. Truscott liked the idea. Okay, we're going to go with American Rangers. And he was determined to infuse in his new American Rangers the motto, which he described as, and I love this, speed, vigor, and violence. Speed, vigor, and violence. I wanted to call the book that. I was talked out of it the last till here, but speed, vigor, and violence, yeah. So all this is to say that from a personal point of view, from an inside baseball point of view, yes, I was familiar with Merrill's Marauders in Southeast Asia. I was familiar with Darby's Rangers in North Africa, named after their commandant, by the way, William O. Darby. And I knew this, but Ranger boots on the ground in the European theater of operation against what was left of Hitler's most ferocious fighters defending the fatherland, the Vaterland. Who knew? I did not. Tom did not. And so our next step, of course, in researching and reporting and writing a book like this, the next inside baseball step is to discover in the immortal question posed by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, who are these guys? Who are these few hundred Rangers who managed to take a hill that thousands of GIs before them had failed to do? So now Tom and I have always found that the best way to seek an answer to that question, 2 words, contemporaneous writings. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm talking about journals, diaries, letters home. This is the meat and potatoes of what Tom and I do. I don't dislike the big man school of, I'll read a book about Napoleon or Peter the Great or General Sherman, but, probably shouldn't have mentioned him in Atlanta. But what Tom and I tend to concentrate on is we like to write about ordinary men who rise to extraordinary circumstances in combat in wartime. And journals, diaries, the letters, that gives us what we want. So our first big break, so to speak, came while we were digging through the papers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. Big Jim, his troops called him, behind his back, of course. These papers were stored at the University of Texas, and Big Jim was not only the prototypical Ranger commander. He had anchored Texas A&M's football offensive line. He was the center on the offensive line, All-American, back in the 20s. This is the days of leather helmets, no face masks. Big Jim not only looked the part, but he was a smart man. And he was the perfect man to stand up these Rangers, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, from scratch. He had been tasked in 1943, build me a Ranger Battalion in right across the border from Georgia in Camp Bedford Forest in Tennessee. And when he was given these orders, by the way, it was about the same time that Darby's Rangers, who had performed so heroically in North Africa, who had performed so heroically during this Sicilian campaign, they were being decimated on the mainland of Italy. They were about halved. They were cut in half during the landings at Salerno, and they were pretty much obliterated during the landings at Anzio. So while Big Jim Rutter was standing up his Ranger Battalion, he was well aware that once he got overseas to the European Theater of Operations, he was going to be in command of the only Special Forces unit in the American Army. And it weighed on him. But he was a type of man, he could carry that kind of weight. So when it's one thing, once again, to scour the official after-action reports, S2 summaries, that's military intelligence summaries, unit newsletters, they all inform our book. Many of these, of course, were in Lieutenant Colonel Rutter's papers. But it's quite another thing to gain those personal insights I was talking about. Letters, journals, diaries. And as it turned out, Big Jim Rutter was an inherent letter writer to his wife, Margaret. Her nickname was Chick. And we kept finding, Dear Chick, Dear Chick, Dear Chick. It's another book title I kind of wanted. I was talked out of. But Dear Chick, it's going to make somebody a good book title someday. So it was from Rutter's personal letters that we discovered that he not only prized what General Lucian Truscott described as a Ranger's speed, vigor, and violence, but he also wanted to instill a sense of guile in his American Rangers, a strain of independent thinking. That's how he saw Rangers. They had to be physically strong. They had to be tough. They had to be 80 miles. Big Jim, he would take them on 80-mile speed marches from full pack, and he would march right alongside them. He needed physically tough men, but he also wanted smart men who could rely on their brains. It was his thinking, you never knew when a private was going to have to take over a squad or a platoon. You never knew when a corporal was going to have to take over a company. I want all my men to think. I'll give you an example. There was Lieutenant James Eichner, Texan. Ike Eichner, of course, was his nickname. And he had been with the 2nd Ranger Battalion from the beginning under a series of interim commanders or temporary commanders before Rutter arrived. And Ike Eichner didn't think much of these men, but when Rutter, he took the measure of Rutter for several days, and he said, this is the man to lead this team, and it's time for me to confess. Because 2 months earlier, Ike Eichner, who had been a telephone lineman in Texas before the war, when the Rangers were issued their field telephones under these previous ineffectual commanders, they were not issued telephone wire. So Ike Eichner had led a raid on Camp Bedford Forest's telephone wires, up the telephone poles, and he stole hundreds of feet of it. There was still an investigation going on when Rutter arrived. Ike said, I better tell Colonel Rutter that this was me. And he confessed to Colonel Rutter one night, and Rutter gave him a mild dressing down. But later that night wrote to Chick, let me make sure I get this right, secretly delighted to be the commanding officer of a man of such initiative. I want more like him. I mean, now that's the kind of stuff that brings a narrative to life, when you get the inside view of a man like Colonel Rutter. We also discovered in Rutter's letters that he had exhorted one of his lieutenants, the Fool Lieutenant, Bob Edlin. He got the nickname the Fool Lieutenant because when they finally reached Europe, he volunteered to run so many patrols behind enemy lines. After the war was over, Rudder had exhorted Bob Edlin, put your memories down to paper. Put your memories down to paper. Sure enough, we found 2 elderly sisters in Minnesota who had transcribed Bob Edlin's notes. The full lieutenant, they still had the transcript, and they agreed to send it to us, or a copy of it. In Rudder's letters, this is kind of personal for me, we found out that he described a chick how he was going to put in one of his platoon sergeants, Len Lamel was the man's name, Len Lamel. He was going to put him in for the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military award, for his actions atop the cliffs of Pointe-du-Hoc at Normandy Beach. And Lamel found out about this, and Lamel went to Rudder and he said, please don't. Please don't, because Lamel knew that any recipient of the Medal of Honor was automatically pulled from a combat posting, because the U.S. War Department would not risk a Medal of Honor winner being killed, or worse, being captured and paraded about by the enemy. So Lamel was like, please don't do it, Lieutenant Colonel, please don't do it. And so Lamel instead received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Normandy Beach, which is, DSC is our second highest military award. Now, I mentioned Lamel because I started to look into them. Who turns down being put in for the Medal of Honor? This guy intrigued me. Turns out that prior to the war and post-war, Lamel grew up on a town on the Jersey Shore, which is 4 towns away from where I live. So I went to the library over there, and I found some people who had known Lamel. He had been a famous lawyer. He had been president of the New Jersey Symphony Department. He'd been on the board of directors of several corporations. And I found out about this other retired. Now, Len was long dead. He had died in 2011 at the age of 91, lived a good long life. And I found this other retired Army colonel who's still alive. Paul Zygo was his name. And he had initiated a posthumous campaign to award Len Lamel the Medal of Honor. Get this, not at Normandy Beach, but at Top Hill 400. I'm saying, this guy, if he's deemed worthy enough by people for 2 Medal of Honors, I got to know what's going on with this. So I reached out to Paul Zygo, and he agreed to meet me in a coffee shop. When he walked into that coffee shop, and he had a giant briefcase. And when he started pulling out files this thick, I said, I've hit the mother lode. I've hit the mother lode, contemporaneous writings. I've hit the mother lode. So sure enough, Colonel Zygo, he had collected letters from Len Lamel's battalion mates describing not only Len Lamel's heroics atop Pointe-du-Hoc and atop Hill 400, but describing their own reminiscences, their own memories from stateside training, from practicing on the cliffs of southwest England and Dover for climbing the cliffs of Pointe-du-Hoc, through the Brittany campaign, and through their slog across France and Belgium, and into the Hurtgen Forest. I mean, I was giddy when I got home that night. I called Tom, my writing partner, Tom. I said, Tom, you're not going to believe what I got. And I told him, and he said, guess what I got? And he hit me with a 1-2 punch. Remember James Eichner, the comms officer who stole the telephone wire? Well, Tom found out. It turns out James Eichner, when he got home from the war, he designated himself something of an unofficial historian of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. And James Eichner was also something of a pack rat. And before he died, he donated, his papers measured 6 linear feet of boxes. He donated that to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Now, I've done research at the Army War College in Carlisle. They're wonderful people. I said to Tom, I'm getting down there tomorrow. And he said, stop. Remember I said 1-2 punch? That was his 1 punch. That was his right. His left, he said, he had also tracked down the only living son of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's chief surgeon. Dr. Walter E. Block was the man's name. Doc Block, of course, they called him. And Get this, Doc Block's son, Jeffrey, still had a copy of his father's handwritten combat diary and was willing to Xerox it and send it to us. And, well, from there, the floodgates were just more or less thrown open for Tom Clavin and me. And we were like Hansel and Gretel following the breadcrumbs. I mean, we turned up a wealth of personal material. It turns out that several Rangers, right after the war, they wrote either unpublished or self-published memoirs. We also found this off-the-record unit diary. It was rather lewd and ribald. It was not meant. It was eyes only for the Rangers. We also got a hold of that. I mean, we got a hold of. I'm saying, what a literate bunch these guys were. I mean, these Rangers, when they weren't fighting, they were writing left and right. So, all of these contemporaneous resources, as I mentioned, they further informed. Of course, I'm not backing away from after-action reports and all the biographies and autobiographies written by World War II veterans. Of course, we use them as research also. But these intimate contemporaneous writings, they allowed us to track the intimate and valorous movements of Rudder's Rangers, as they came to be known, as they moved across France, Belgium, into the German frontier in the Hurtgen Forest. And in fact, they constitute the narrative of the last hill into the Hurtgen Forest. I mean, I'm thinking the wounded Len Lamel, he's got a Mauser bullet in his side, a Mauser, perhaps saving the entire D-Day invasion. I'll let you be the judge of that when you write the book. And then doing it over again atop Pointe du Hoc. Once again, you can decide whether you think he was deserving of the Medal of Honor. The full lieutenant, Bob Edlin, he once led a four-man patrol, 4 men, and without firing a shot, he captured 1,000 Germans, defending perhaps the most fearsome artillery emplacement on the Brittany Peninsula. And how he did it, I don't want to give too much away, but think capturing the commandant, think hand grenade, and think hand grenade down here to commandant before the commandant told his 1,000 men to. I'm thinking right now, those two. I talked about Len Lamel and Ike Eichner, the 3 of them, and Bob Edlin. They're emblematic of the protagonists, the characters we write about in the last hill. I'm thinking of the immense physical strength of the Dog Company commander, Captain Harold the Duke Slater. The Duke, I mean, even his name swaggered. The Duke was blown off his landing craft about a half mile from Normandy Beach. And the English Channel was frigid that time. And maybe 5 or 6 days later, when we had finally broken off the beach, the 2nd Ranger Battalion went through the sad ritual of going through the barracks bags of everyone they considered dead. And what they would do is they would refold the stuff, send it back to mostly moms and dads, but sometimes wives. But anything that was in there, condoms, pinups, risque playing cards, they're not going to send that back to the States. They would either throw it away or pass it around among themselves. So in the Duke's barracks bag, they found an unopened bottle of White Horse Scotch. They took it out. They passed it around. They all took a swig in memory of the Duke, who they assumed had drowned in the English Channel. 12 days later, when the Duke shows up, he said, "Where's my Scotch?" I got a patrol to run. Sorry. The captain wants to see me. Sorry about that. I mean, I'm thinking of the daring trek, 1,000-mile journey on foot of Fox Company's captain, Otto Big Stoop. Nobody remembers Terry and the Pirates, but Terry and the Pirates was a comic strip, and there was a giant in it called Big Stoop. And Otto Masney was 6'5", so he got the nickname Big Stoop. He escaped from a German POW camp and made his way 1,000 miles on foot to safety. I'm thinking of the unnatural climbing ability of one of my favorite characters, Herman Bubby Stein, a New Yorker. Yeah, we got a New Yorker in the 2nd Rangers. In fact, Stein's ability to climb in training. A lot of the Rangers said, wait a minute, this guy, was he a member of was he a second story man for the Jewish mob back in New York before the war? They weren't quite sure what Bubby Stein was up to, but at Pont du Hoc on Normandy Beach, he scampered up that cliff. Third of the way up, 2/3 of the way up, his Mae West, still wearing his Mae West life preserver, it inflated, almost knocked him backwards. But he made it to the top. And then, 40 years later, at a commemorative ceremony for the D-Day invasion, Bubby Stein, in his mid-60s, he went up the cliff again. He went up the cliff again. I mean, I'm thinking the chilling journey across Omaha Beach of Easy Company's Lieutenant Ralph Garnson, a Chicago kid. When Ralph Garnson finally made it across the beach, and a quarter of his company was left. Everyone else was dead or wounded. And he's got his back against the seawall, and his staff sergeant says, "You've been hit." And he was like, oh, his canteen had a bullet hole, his pack had a bullet, stock of his M1 had a bullet. There was a bullet hole through both of his pants legs and through both sleeves of his field jacket. None had found flesh. 7 times he had been shot, and not once had he been wounded. In fact, Tom Hanks admitted when he was making the movie Saving Private Ryan that he modeled his character on Lieutenant Ralph Garnson. And one of my favorites, the BAR man, Browning automatic rifle, L. Rod Petty. Now, L. Rod went on to become, as you'll read, the heart and soul of Fox Company. He was a sergeant, but he almost never made it. Because you see, L. Rod, he was a country boy. He grew up in this state, in the south of this state, the red dirt, piney country of Georgia. And L. Rod was a fighter and a football player. And L. Rod had no front teeth top, no front teeth bottom. And it bothered the hell out of Big Jim Rutter, Lieutenant Colonel Rutter, that Rutter just did not like the cut of L. Rod's jib. And he went to Big Stoop Maz and he said, "We got to transfer this guy out. He just he's not a squared away Ranger. Look at him." And Stoop would, "No, Colonel, he's our best BAR man. The people flock around him." But finally, Rutter had just had enough. He saw, and Elrod had been issued dentures, but he just didn't like the feel of them. They hurt. And so finally, after one meeting, Colonel Rutter pulled Elrod aside. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Petty, but I'm going to transfer you back to your original outfit." And Petty said, "Can I make my case, sir?" Lieutenant Colonel Rutter said, "Sure, go ahead." And he went on to explain how he had grown up. His father had beaten him. It was a broken home. And he said, "The Rangers are my family. I love the Rangers. I want to be a Ranger for the rest of my life if I can." But I think it was Elrod's last sentence that probably convinced Rutter to allow him to remain, because Elrod opened his mouth, showed his gums, top, and he said, "And Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel, I ain't planning on biting no Nazis to death." There are so many characters. I mean, I could go on. We'd be here all night, and I'm not going to put you through that. And so, you know what? The words I promised. And so, in conclusion, we arrive at the heart and the denouement of the last hill. That is Rutter's Rangers fighting their way through the Hurtgen Forest into the base of Hill 400 and preparing to climb that hill. And what a firefight it was to culminate our story, their story, really. On the morning of December 6th, 1944, as about half of what was left of the Rangers of the 2nd Battalion spread out along the base of, to the north and south of the base of Hill 400 to provide covering fire, 130 men, 130 Rangers prepared to ascend that hill. One Ranger described it as trying to climb a 1,300-foot children's playground slide, 45-degree angle, slippery with snow and ice, while enemy machine gunners and riflemen were pouring bullets and potato mashers down the slope at you. About 100 men 100 Rangers made it to the top of Hill 400. And after vicious hand-to-hand fighting, both sides had no time to reload. They were fighting each other with trench knives, with bayonets, with entrenching tools, with helmets. They were using helmets to kill each other. The Rangers, the American Rangers, managed to secure a perimeter. As the day turned to night, the Rangers turned back 5 counterattacks. In between, without reinforcements, they were being bombarded by a steady stream of artillery. Those 100 men who had survived the climb to the top, by the next morning there was 50 left. And then, shortly after noon, there were 30. In mid-afternoon, Lieutenant Len Lamel, who had been field promoted to lieutenant, he'd become an officer. He had been a sergeant. He was the only officer left standing on Hill 400. He gathered the 4 non-coms who were still effective fighters, and he said to them, listen, I just took a head count. We have 22 men left. 22 men. Several of them are the bunker that the German artillery spotters had used. The Rangers had turned it into a morgue and an aid station. Several of those 22 had crawled out and taken their weapons and said, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in the line. And Lamel said to them, he said, I understand and I am well aware that the United States Army is not a democracy. You take orders top down. But I'm going to make an exception this one time. He pointed down the hill. And he said, Germans are reamassing. They're coming again. And this time, Wehrmacht infantry soldiers had been reinforced by a company of elite German paratroopers. They could see. The Americans could see. They could tell by the uniforms who was coming at them. And Len said to those 4, he said to the staff sergeant, the platoon sergeant, the 2 regular sergeants, he said, I'm going to let you take a vote, and I'm going to vote myself. We can either retreat back down the west side and gather the rest of our Rangers, maybe. Do it again. We could take it again. They won't harm our wounded. Our dead are our dead. They're in there. They're not going to come alive again. Or we can stand here. There's 22 of us. Or we can stand here and fight. And Lamel, yes, vote, 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 vote. And then Lamel voted. And that vote, well, if you want to know what that vote is, you're going to have to read the damn book, aren't you? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I am sure we have some questions from the audience tonight, so I will bring the mic to you.
No hard ones, please.
So we get the question on the recording, but right there.
That was so interesting and such a storytelling. It makes you want to read the book, believe me.
I don't care if you read it, just buy it.
Already did. So did you actually, with the co-author, go to Hill 400?
No,
or the forest at all? Or?
I was explaining before. I have slogged over, except for Halsey's Typhoon, I didn't see much sense in going out to the middle of Pacific on a boat just to see where the Pacific Fleet went under. But every one of our books, I'm the reacher. I have slogged for the Red Cloud book. I spent months, Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, for the Daniel Boone book. I go. Right, I had made arrangements for a guide to take me, a Brit who's living in Germany, to take me through Germany, through the Hurtgen Forest. COVID fell. I put a deposit down, not insubstantial, and as we're going, we're writing, and finally it's getting closer and closer to the deadline. I mean, when I say close, I mean, we're like a year away. I got to get there. I can't get into Germany. I can't get into Belgium. So finally, I said to the guy who was not returning my deposit, and I kind of understood. I said, do you know anybody in Germany near the Hurtgen Forest, the Belgian boy, who operates drones? He said, yeah, I know a guy. turned me on to this guy, and I said, could you be my translator? He said, no, his English is very good. I said, well, just tell him I'm going to call. Tell him who I am. I'm legitimate. I arranged with this guy. We're on the phone together for a week. He's sending. I said, "Can you put a camera on your drone?" He said, "Sure. I can ship videotapes to you." So we're on the phone. I was like, "Oh yeah, stop. Hover. Okay, on to Brandenburg. Now I want to see what Kleinhau looks like. Now let's get to the hill. Would you go up slowly up the west side and then down the east side?" So this is the only book where I actually did not walk it myself. COVID stopped me. So the next best thing I thought was this drone stuff. So anyway.
How long did it take you from beginning to end to write the book?
Oh, 35, 40 years. Now, because I have a co-author, usually I would imagine it would take about 4 or 5 years, but Tom and I, we have such a good assembly line thing going. I'm trying to think, 2, 3 years maybe? So it would have taken longer if it was just me or just Tom. Yes, sir.
How did you and Tom first meet and start collaborating together?
I was a newspaper man in New York City for late 70s, most of the 80s. And then when I started going overseas, I was a war correspondent for 20 years, mostly for magazines. And so I did not need to be in New York City anymore, so I moved out to the east end of Long Island, East Hampton. And Tom was the editor of the local newspaper out there, the East Hampton Independent, and he was a stringer for the New York Times. And of course, there's only so many bars you pretty much run, especially in the wintertime out there. You run into everybody, and we became friends, and eventually we became collaborators.
How was the 2nd Ranger Battalion formed? Were they referred from existing units?
Of course, yes. Rudder had a culling regime, a regiment, I should say, where I'd say for every 3 men that volunteered for the Rangers, 2. One washed out the very first day, and the other one eventually washed out. Rudder was still culling Rangers when they reached Europe, not to mention England. He wanted, like I said, he wanted tough physical men, but he wanted smart men too. When they were in England for the 3 months before D-Day, every morning before they got up, his officers would pull 3 or 4 Rangers out of the line, hand them a map, and on it would be circled some hamlet, small town, big city, somewhere Scotland, Wales, or England. And these men would be tasked with, you have to get to the city, this hamlet, this town, this shire. You have to get something that proves you were there, and depending on how far away it was, you have to get back by a certain amount of time. Rudder wanted these men thinking for themselves. They wanted them to take responsibility in case they had to take responsibility. And he was constantly, and people were always getting injured too. And once they were injured, they were out. So I can't, of the 500 men who, say, shipped over from the States to England, the 500 Rangers of the 2nd Battalion, I'd say they were probably the result of 5,000 or 6,000 volunteers.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. I used to live in Belgium, and I've been to Bastogne so many times. I know all the history, read all the books. How far is Hill 400 from Bastogne?
About 300 miles. They had planned to run through the Hurtgen Forest, and because of what the Rangers did, now they had to redeploy to go the Moshu Gap, and I'm not sure if I'm saying the Monschau Gap below the Hurtgen Forest, and the Aachen Gap. That's where they poured through. And I'm not saying the Rangers saved the Battle of the Bulge, but they did delay the Germans.
Now, how far is that from the cemetery on the German border of Belgium, where the Americans from the Bulge were?
The cemetery's in the Hurtgen Forest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Been there several times as well.
Yeah, you know who's buried there? What's his name? The German general who committed suicide. Big Hitler guy. Anyway, we're getting off topic here. I'm sorry. Well, thank you again for coming out. I really appreciate you coming out on a Monday night, giving some of your precious time to a jamoke like me, and I hope you had some fun. I had a lot of fun. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And we will meet all of you out in the lobby if you'd like your books signed. We have a few minutes to do that. Thanks so much.